Well, if I was really good, I would have figured a way to roll from that one into this like seamlessly. So we just transferred all the audience over since we had 80 people watching over there. But I don't know how to do that. So here we are, another stream. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you doing?
I hope you hopefully had a better week than me since our YouTube went down. Oh my God. It's just been what are you guys doing? They're so annoying to deal with.
I heard your explanation on the last show, and that actually sounded like good news in that, to the degree that it could be, in that it was a readily solvable problem. It wasn't that YouTube has decided that they were going to put a target on your forehead. It's that some nefarious actor that they were able to figure out it was a nefarious actor. They're not blaming you. It just takes now. You just
right now they're blaming me. That's the whole thing. It's like we just figured out what it is, and now we're trying to get them to listen to say it wasn't us. We were hacked. Here's the proof.
I see. Okay.
So that's the point we're at right now. We're at that point where.
Well, at least you know why it happened.
Yeah.
And you can explain why it happened. It's just a matter of getting them to,
yeah. What are you going to do? Yeah, I know. It's a challenge, but listen, life's made up of challenges, right? That it's just like you're going life is one wave to the next. That's it. There are always waves. The only question is how you ride them.
I told Pat that I was going to point out that normally Starfleet Tactical isn't on the Axanar channel. It's just on the Ares channel. The one time you put it on the Axanar channel, the channel gets banned. And so it must be Pat's fault.
It's all Pat's fault. I'm glad we agree on that. And so, we had to give him a 1-week suspension. His fault.
Yeah, he's actually he and his wife are visiting some friends right now. So he thought he might be able to make it back in time, but he sent me a message saying that he's not going to make it back in time. So
here's my rule of thumb with Pat. Pat, if you can't be in front of your computer at home, take the night off. The last time his whole I'm heading home in my car and I've got my phone on my lap looking at the bottom of the steering wheel. That all didn't work.
Yeah, that was an experiment. The experiment was a success. We learned that didn't work.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. We learned another way not to make a light bulb. So, well, good. How are you? So what's new in your world this week? Anything interesting in the world of professional wargaming?
Let's see. I guess the things that are interesting is that next week is the Connections Wargaming Conference. This year, I'm not very much involved with it, but frequently.
Tell us about it. Tell us about it.
So it's a conference that's been going on since the mid-1990s. Okay. It's organized by a guy named Matt Caffrey, a.k.a. the guy in the cubicle next to mine at work. In fact, the Connections Conference is the primary reason why I know Matt and why I'm at the job I'm currently at, although I had met Matt before I started going to the Connections Conference. It's a conference for professional wargamers, but this year it's going to be online. And so if you're interested, do a search for Connections Wargaming, and the registration information is there. And once you're sort of registered, they'll send you all the information on how to log on and do it. And so, which reminds me, I need to go track that down before 10 o'clock on Monday when the conference starts. We decided to do it as we were going to make a virtue out of necessity and try to organize it in such a way that we could cover all time zones from Los Angeles to Berlin. So it starts at 10 a.m., finishes about 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Okay.
And so, like I said, this is actually kind of an off year in that I'm not doing any presentations at this conference. I usually do 1 or 2.
Gotcha. So did you see Lower Decks? Is that your?
I have not seen it. And it's not something, it doesn't speak to me as an author friend of mine. says. It's not something I really feel like I have to, that my life won't be complete if I don't see it.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I'll watch it, but right now I'm in the middle of watching For All Mankind, which is awesome. So,
I need to get back to that. I need to get back to that.
That is great. That is just one great show. Really, really pleased with that. So, well, good. What do you want to talk about tonight?
Well, so, originally we were going to go through the Nemesis battle, but I don't want to do that without Pat here, because Pat's
we'll put it off for another week.
Done a lot more thinking about that than I have. So I was sort of thinking about different topics we could talk about instead. And one of them that sort of fits in with some of the other things we've talked about is the idea of modularity in ship design. Yeah. And because I'm actually utterly fascinated with both how modern naval warships are made and how I think Federation starships are probably made. As we see some evidence in the TV show, we see more evidence in the technical manual, and then there's things that I'm sort of inferring based upon how I expect it to work out in that regard. So if you're up for that, we can talk about that.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
Okay. So when I say modularity, there's a couple of different ways you can think about modularity in ship design and construction. But I think probably the most easiest place to start is you can have modularity in your components. So it's like you've got a standard set of parts that you build stuff out of, right? You can have modularity in your construction, which you put things together in such a way, you build modules and you build the ship out of modules. And then you can have modularity design so that you can outfit the ship in a modular way and then re-outfit it if you need to. And then finally, you can have just basically routine swappable components. And so in the real world, we have examples of all these things. Like when US Navy aircraft carriers are built, they build these huge blocks, like 200-ton blocks, and they lift them into place with big cranes and put them in place, and then they do all the connections and weld it all together. But I mean, you've got entire compartments that are basically as one great big block, and they put it together that way. It's not like they're not like carrying in individual things and individual things, and they do all that sort of off to one side, which means you've always got the cranes going, right? And you can build stuff in other places, and that's especially like with submarine design. You know, they may build a part of the submarine in an entirely different facility, and they bring in a train or something like that.
Sure.
And I have
also just the advances in technology mean the measurements that they're meeting, their tolerances have shrunk to practically nothing.
Yeah, and in some cases you have to have tolerances like that.
Yeah.
And so, like with submarines in particular, I can't go into any of the details on that, but I mean, submarines have gotten quieter and quieter. They've gotten more precise over time, and you just, as in order to make them even more quieter, you have to get more precise in how you measure things, how you put stuff together, et cetera, et cetera. Very small differences can make a huge amount of difference.
Right, I'm sure.
Over time. So, in fact, I've got a picture here of some submarine stuff. Let me find it real quick. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen. Hopefully this will work better for me than it did for Pat. Okay, are you seeing anything?
Not yet.
Oh, okay, there we go. There we go. Share.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, so This is a Swedish submarine, the A-26 class submarine. And so one of the things about the Swedes are kind of interesting when it comes to their military stuff.
I didn't even know they had submarines.
Oh yeah, the Swedes are really good with submarines. They have their act together.
Really?
The Swedes the Swedes, the lesson the Swedes learned in World War II was like right before, when it looked like there was going to be a war, they were desperate to buy aircraft and some other stuff from other people. And nobody was willing to sell them to them, just because everybody said, look, there's going to be a war and we need the stuff for us. And so the Swedes sort of vowed that they were never going to let that happen again. And that's actually where Saab came from. Saab stands for Swedish Aircraft something Corporation or something. That's what Saab was actually. And they built cars in order to subsidize their plane production.
Wow, really? Yeah, well, I remember the Saab Draken, was it?
Yeah, the
totally
Draken, the Vegan, and
that was a badass.
And you know the Swedish S tank.
I love the old S. I love the old S.
Yeah, and if you go back to like back when I was in college, if I had time, I'd go into the library and I'd just go into the stacks and grab the latest issues of International Defense Review, which was a great magazine before Janes took it over and ruined it. But back in the day, you know, this is the mid 1980s. The Swedes were considered at the forefront of tank design. They had all sorts of interesting ideas because they were basically, they were about time for them to replace their tank force. They had all sorts of really cool tank design stuff. And so it's like, it's the big ones in tank design were the US, the Russians, the Brits, the Germans, and the Swedes. And it's like one of those doesn't quite fit with the others. But the same with submarines. The Swedes are really good on submarines. And this particular design of this submarine, the reason why it's split into sections like that is because they sell 3 different variants of it. Their plan is to make 3 different variants of it. And one of them, there's a short range version, a medium range version, and a long range version. And the difference is how many of those modules you include. They all include the front. They all include the one with the sail, what used to be called the conning tower, but is more properly in US parlance called the sail, and in British parlance is called the fin. And then they all include the back module, but the short range one, that's all it includes. The medium range one adds one of those 2 compartments, and the long range one adds the second one. And the Swedes are planning on buying the medium range one for themselves because they don't have to deploy for very long distances.
Right.
But, you know, if you want to deploy for very long distances, they'll sell you the long range one. And one of the things about Swedish submarines is this, as it says in this article here, when the Swedes when they would take a submarine in and to sort of like to do a midlife overhaul, they will replace modules, and you basically get a different submarine coming out. It may not be the same submarine at all. By the way, the website here is hisutton.com. The name of the website is Covert Shores. Hayden Sutton is a English financial analyst living in Switzerland, if I remember correctly. And his hobby is just doing submarine stuff. And so like he writes for Forbes now, and he's done some just fantastic stuff. And I love his website. And even though I'm not really a naval analyst like I used to be, in that I don't get paid for it in my day job anymore, I still consider it a naval analyst, and I still spend a lot of time on Covert Shores. Let's see. So one other thing from his site. Nope. There we go. So he does this article on rafting. And rafting is the methodology whereby you build submarines and you raft the equipment. Basically, you build the submarine. So you've got the hull here, got the round hull, and then this big module, and that's an engine module of some sort. It goes in on rails and only has limited contact points with the hull, and those contact points all have sound deadening equipment on it.
Wow. And
so the idea is that you're trying to prevent vibrations from being transmitted to the outer hull and from the outer hull to the water. Right. And so, but part and parcel of this is that it lends itself really well to modular construction techniques, because like, you build this engine component out here, where out in the rest of the factory, where guys can get into it, and you can bring in cranes to bring all the stuff in, etc. And then you slide it into the hull.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Put another set of rings on. So let me skip down here a little bit. This is all showing sound mount stuff, but let me skip down here to a little bit. See this in the back?
Right.
I think this is the British one, if I remember correctly. British submarine construction. They're sliding this entire module in. In fact, there's a better view of that. It just slides into the hull on rails. There it goes. They're just sliding it in.
That's amazing.
And then they mount it in place. And here's some stuff. It's Russian patent stuff. So like in this rafting, only those orange components are places where there's actually connectivity between the raft and the hull. So, and you put like rubber mounts, maybe pneumatic mounts of some sort there, to keep that vibration from being transmitted. And so I'm less enamored than many people are with the submarines as a model for spacecraft sort of meme. And I think it's as good as any other meme. I think the main problem there is that people don't understand exactly how dependent a submarine is on its environment. It's not really self-contained. It's really only marginally more self-contained than a surface ship is self-contained, in that it uses the water as a propulsive mechanism. They're pulling in water to generate oxygen. They're pulling in water to cool things. Basically a submarine only works because it's bathed in this big pool of water. And so it's constantly interacting with its environment. It's not really a bubble in the same way that a spacecraft has to be its own independent bubble. It's close, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you can't learn anything by looking at that. It's just, it's not a no-brainer in the way that people think. Like you couldn't just take a submarine hull and sort of weld a few things shut and put some rockets on it. Now you've got a spacecraft. There's been a couple of novels written with that as sort of the premise behind it.
Really?
Yeah, that doesn't work as well as it sounds. It sounds cool, but it doesn't quite work as well. And so there you got an idea of what some of that rafting looks like. So that's a very modular way of approaching things.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and that has some real application to how you might design spacecraft. And so that's really a construction technique. I mean, even with the Swedes, with that multi-part design, if you want to change that, you're talking about cutting your ship in half and slicing parts off and grafting new parts on, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really a construction technique. It's not really something that you do on a more routine basis. On a more routine basis, you've got the Standflex system that the Royal Danish Navy came up with. And so Standflex basically says, I build in sockets into my ship. And I plug things into those sockets, and I've got a set of standard interfaces and a set of standard things and like a standard module size. So like each socket is 10 by 10 or whatever, and I plug stuff into it. In fact, so there's a mine countermeasure Standflex module. So it's designed to go into a big square hole in the deck. You can see the below deck part. You can see the above deck part. Now what you're looking at here, it's a mine countermeasure module. This yellow thing at the back, that is lowered into the water. And so what I think we've got here is a crane winch type mechanism that plugs into a module that at the rear of the ship that allows it to lower into the water. So you still have issues like you're not going to put this kind of module on the top of a ship, right? It's got to go in a particular place. You've got modules that might be missile tubes or might be guns or whatever. You've got sighting issues. You've still got weight issues. You still have to pay attention to all that stuff. But this is a module in storage for such a time as when it's needed. And you can pretty routinely go in and swap those things out. The StandFlex modules are designed so that you can basically take your ship into a shipyard, and 4 days later, the ship leaves the shipyard and it's got an entirely different set of modules on board. It's ready to rock and roll.
That's great.
Now, the Germans, 10 years before that, came up with something called MECO. That's really a construction technique. And a MECO type ship, it's got a bunch of modular things, but if you want to reconfigure one of those ships, you take it into a shipyard and it spends a couple of months there and it comes out as a new ship. But StandFlex is really designed to be entirely portable. The last kind is the routine swappable modules, is what we've done with literal combat ship. Now, this has not worked out nearly as well as we would like for a bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with the concept itself. It has to do everything with the implementation. But the idea with the littoral combat ship is that, you go into port for maybe an hour or two and you swap those things out. It's really about how fast can you move a shipping container sized piece of gear safely. And however fast you can do that, you can be ready to pull out of port again. So this is intended to be routine swappable, but it does involve like opening a hole in your deck and filling the hole in your deck. LCS is about moving it into a modular bay and just bolting it down and then connecting all the power couplings and the data couplings, and now it's ready to go. Maybe there's probably water in there also because some of that gear is probably water cooled. And it's ready to go. They even treat the crews as modular, at least in theory. In theory, the crew is assigned to the module, and if the module's in port, so is the crew. Practice, I don't think that's how that's going to end up working out. So that's kind of how we do it now. So I get thinking about, how does this work in science fiction? How might this work in Star Trek?
By the way, I just have to share something real quick.
Oh, go for it.
Just because it's from my childhood, and that is that.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I learned all about the Swedish S tank, by buying the Aurora model kit of it and building that. I'm just like, okay, this is the coolest tank ever. It's got no turret. How cool is that?
Yeah, and a lot of people say a tank without a turret is not a tank, it's a tank destroyer. To which my response is, tank destroyers and tanks were designed with different missions in mind and were used in ways that were appropriate to their mission. The Swedes called it a tank, designed it to have tank-like attributes, used it like a tank. It's a tank.
There you go. All right. I'll link the.
So we know from you can just look at Star Trek ships and see that there's a high degree of modularity there, right? They're clearly using the same engines. They're clearly using the same saucer sections with some mods here and there. You see the same kind of bridge modules plugged in. You could easily imagine, they've given the excuse or explanation. You can use either word. As to why the bridge changed between the movies of the ship, that they're designed to be routine, that you can just pull out a module and plug in another module. That's great. It's clear that there's a high degree of modularity in terms of how they construct these things.
Well, heck, just look at a Galaxy class and a Nebula class.
Yeah, or the original Constitution and all the stuff from the Franz Joseph like the Ptolemy class. The Ptolemy class. There's a scout and there's a destroyer, and I can never keep clear which is which.
Well, it's the Hermes and the Saladin, and then the Ptolemy is the tug. Is the
tug? Yeah, you're right. And so, they're clearly all built with the same parts, and that makes a lot of sense. Although, it makes less sense when you move into the movie era, when because in the original series, if you believe the Franz Joseph blueprints, then warp engines are really sort of self-contained things, right? They don't have this intermixed chamber and all this stuff going around. You don't have this warp core that's in the secondary hull that's then feeding the engines. The engines were really kind of self-contained. They were one-stop shops that had everything they need within the engine. And as a result, it makes a lot of sense that you can just sort of mix and match all the parts. And you don't need a secondary hull. So you just deal with the fact that you don't have nearly as much support capacity for additional missions as you would if you had a secondary hull. Okay, that works for me. And we see that design ethos go all the way forward with the Nebula, etc. You see some other instances in between where you don't see as many of the Ambassador class era ships have. I really think, and I can't remember, I had this conversation, I can't remember if I had it with you or whether it was just something I had on the side with Pat on a phone call about how I really think that the Galaxy class was a major refresh effort. You had sort of the Constitution class era, bunch of stuff built out of that. And then for a while there, they seemed to just kind of be doing one-off designs because I think they had this I think Starfleet got a lot bigger. They had a lot of established designs like the Miranda and the Excelsiors that they built a bunch of them, and they just hung around for a really long time.
Yes, they did.
And then they kind of got to the point where, it's really time to refresh the fleet. And so I think one of the reasons why it took 20 years for them to design the Galaxy class is that they didn't look at it as we're designing the Galaxy class. They looked at it as we're designing the Lego pieces that we're going to be building starships out of for the next 100 years.
Yeah, I can Okay, definitely can see that.
And so they're very modular in their approach to things. Now, of course, the board came along and screwed all that up by demanding that they needed to get some new parts in sooner because they hadn't really designed for the Borg, but I think that really kind of works. Other things that you've seen from some of the various modularity efforts over the years, like at one point the Brits decided that they were going to try to go for modular construction, and so they built in some things that were sort of the logical things to go along with that. And some of them are surprisingly commonsensical, and you sort of, when you hear it, you go, why didn't they do that all along? And it includes things like make your doors big enough that you can move equipment through them, and make your passageways big enough that you can move equipment down the passageway. And so that, like, if I replace the computers, I don't need to cut holes in the side of my ship to do it. Now, you can cut holes in the side of your ship, but when you do that, that's called hot work. Anytime you're welding, that's called hot work. Hot work dramatically increases the time. It dramatically increases the manpower because you can set your ship on fire if you're doing hot work. The Russians have a navy that is world class in several categories. One of them is setting their own submarines on fire by doing hot work. And so anytime you can avoid doing hot work, you can make that situation a lot better, a lot faster, a lot more routine swappable. So the Brits basically just said, instead of building a 3-foot wide door, we'll build a 5-foot wide door so we can get the big palletized computer gear or whatever it is that we're moving out, we can move it out. And we'll build the passageway wide enough that we can take it to some place where we can crane it off the ship. And if we have to do hot work, we only have to do it in one location as opposed to do it in multiple locations. And we can not have to come through. It's interesting, like on a U.S. aircraft carrier, if you go into the aircraft carrier, like you go into the ship's store, one of the 2 ship stores, they've got these big things on the floor. They're like metal caps with lots of bolts holding them down, and some very thick windows that you really can't see through. And if you look above, you'll see that there's a hatchway that's got a lot of bolts around it. And it's because that ship stores right over one of the nuclear reactors.
Ah.
But the thing is, you look in the ceiling and you've got this big, it's clearly designed to be taken out. But that doesn't go all the way to the top of the ship. At some point, you have to start cutting holes in the deck to pull.
Why is that?
Because in the long run, it's actually easier to cut holes in the deck than it is to make all the deck stuff flush and to make it have the structural integrity. You're better off cutting a hole in the deck and then welding it back together again. Because, of course, anytime you're going to need to get into the reactor like that, anytime you're going to refueling, like on the Nimitz classes, they were only designed to do that like once over the lifetime of the ship. So like at the 25-year mark, it goes into the shipyard for 5 years. And yeah. So, and they pull all the stuff out, they revamp everything, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as a concept, aircraft carriers are actually kind of the first implementation of modular ship construction that we ever saw, in that their weapon system is almost entirely modular. It's airplanes, right? You want to upgrade the ship, you fly the old planes off, you fly some new planes on. You've now upgraded your weapon system. Well, that's a good first approximation, but you still have radars, you still have fire control computers, you have all the gear that goes along with that. Yeah, you only need to refuel once. That's what you're doing, and when you're spending 5 years in the yard and you're pulling stuff out of the reactors, you're refueling it. So from that standpoint, there's more to it than that. And the other thing is, airplanes have gotten bigger and heavier over time, by and large. Now, we're not at the maximum now. The R5A Vigilantes were at least the combat version. The A5 Vigilante was the biggest and heaviest airplane that we would routinely fly off of carriers. So we're not at the absolute heaviest. But as those airplanes got bigger, the smaller carriers got sort of relegated to the wayside. So for a while there, we had ASW carriers that would fly helicopters, and basically those were old World War II carriers that couldn't handle the high-end jets. And so they basically said, all right, we'll cover them with helicopters and stuff like that. So it's interesting. Our fleet doctrine changed based upon the gear that we had left over from World War II.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
And then when we started getting rid of that gear, then our doctrine changed, and we stopped doing this. Attack carrier meant that you had big, beefy fixed-wing airplanes, and ASW carrier meant that you had a bunch of helicopters and smaller airplanes designed to find submarines. You moved away from that, and everything became a fleet carrier again. And basically, there was only really one type of aircraft carrier again. Well, it could be nuclear or conventional, but I mean, really only, other than that, only one designation. And that's why sometimes you'll see CVAN, and then later you see CVN, and that's because after they changed that designation, the A part went away. So when I look at various starships from Star Trek going all the way back to the original series, one of the things I see is big doors, really wide passageways. You see that on old ships, you see that on newer ships. So it looks like they're planning on moving stuff around. You never see them moving big things of gear down, but we've never seen really a ship being refitted. I think the closest we saw to that was in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, where you saw lots of stuff going around, and occasionally you saw some guys that were doing some work with consoles and stuff like that. But you didn't see them like installing. They were almost done, so all the moving big stuff around the ship's part of that work process had finished by then. And so I think that this is a universe where they plan ahead for things like that. You see a lot of, I think, modularity in terms of the component. So like there's standard technologies they use to build everything. I don't get this impression that you've got a bunch of different vendors and they all have their proprietary widgets. and they're selling their proprietary systems. It looks like it's something where everything's pretty standard. I suspect that there's a lot of modularity in terms of like moving in assemblies and stuff, but I also think that this is a force where everybody is very highly trained, and where if you need to design a new gizmo, you can design it pretty quickly. And you can probably use, the manufacturing techniques they have involving replicators can probably create new gizmos pretty quickly. So, I don't think that when Geordi or Scotty is coming up with the new gizmo, that he's necessarily going into a storeroom where you've got the big wall of parts with, bins, and he's pulling parts out. And I don't think that's how that's happening. I think there's a lot of CAD CAM and a lot of beaming stuff into place and things like that to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, they talk about transporter-based surgery.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because as we were talking either last week or the week before, there's a lot of very interesting things about how replicators work, and you get individual little glimpses in the various tech manuals, but all those glimpses are within a particular context without any statement saying, does it apply to other contexts? Mm-hmm. So like for food replication, it says that the base that they use as the food replicator is designed to minimize the difference in quantum states that need to be accrued, so in order to minimize the cost of replication. Well, I would think that would apply to replicating gear as well, but that statement was specifically made with regard to food replicators. Don't see any reason why it wouldn't apply to the bunch of other stuff. And as I asked the question the last time, does that mean that if I want to build something that I basically, like, here's a pile of this material, here's a pile of that material, here's a pile of this material, and the replicator sort of dematerializes it and rematerializes it as the assembled thing with the same proportions as the three piles I gave you? Not sure. Not sure. One thing we haven't seen in Star Trek, though, is something that really sort of looks like one of these modular, full-up modular things. And but we see some of this in some fan work. And one of them that I really like is something called the Insignia class ship. And I'm looking for the one I want to start off with for this. Okay. Yeah, I think that's the one I want to start off with. Okay. So I'm going to share the screen again. Okay, share screen. Okay. Unfortunately, it doesn't let me really. Maybe it will let me make it bigger. Let me see if I can make it bigger. Is it going to make it bigger? Yeah, it's not behaving. Okay. So if you look over here, you see the basic idea, and that you've got these pie-shaped modules. That
I remember this. Yeah.
And so this is actually kind of a better one here, where it's, it says exploration vessel with a whole bunch of pie-shaped modules, and then scout vessel without them. I'd probably do this at least a little bit different, in that I'd probably have a module, rather than have two modules in the front, I'd probably have one, and I'd put a navigational deflector on it, and that would just be part of the ship. But this was done by a guy named his name will come to me when I go to his site, actually. Yeah, there we go. It's like I will find his name, because this guy deserves some credit for his work. So you see, there's these, in this iteration of it, you've got a bunch of different modules, and the idea that they're whatever you need. If you need more exploration, you need more labs, you need more whatever, that's what you put on the ship. If you need to increase your offensive or defensive capabilities, you can do that as well. And it's just a really cool design. And it looks like, if you compare the top to the bottom, it looks like the modules are shaped in such a way that they go over a hull. There's sort of a saucer hull, and the module fits over the top of it as it goes in towards the middle. And so that's it from behind. Let's see. And the guy's name is, it's here somewhere. I know I've got it. There's another good. Mark Kingsnorth. And he's got a website that's got a lot of cool stuff on it. So, like I said, you've got this situation where it looks like the modules sort of overlap on the top. And I'm a little surprised that we haven't seen more stuff like this in Star Trek, but I sort of sit back and I think, what's the implication that we don't see that? Is that because they don't think modularity like this is important, or is it because they're able to reconfigure their ships so trivially that they don't need something like this? Is it, is there so much inherent flexibility built in, and they can they go into a shipyard for 3 weeks and it comes out as sort of looking substantially different? It's really kind of weird that Starfleet would make the major modifications that it made to take the Enterprise from the original series to Star Trek the Motion Picture. It's effectively a different ship when it comes out of the yard. And it sort of makes me wonder why you would bother.
Yeah, it's clearly not a refit. I mean, the NX-01 to the NX-01 refit, yeah, I get it. You're adding a secondary hull. Now, I mean, I have my issues with that ship because I don't think you would do that.
Yeah.
I think that's too radical a change. You would just design a new ship. But yeah, when you actually put the old Connie next to the Enterprise refit and look at them, you go, there's no way that ship became that ship.
Yeah.
There's no way. It's two different ships.
If you've ever seen a F-18 Hornet superimposed on top of a Super Hornet, they superficially look the same if you're just sort of looking at them. If you have them sitting side by side, or you see them superimposed over each other, they don't look the same.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, take a look sometime, look at the air intakes and their different size. And now there is some parts commonality there. But the first time I saw them superimposed over each other, my reaction was, wow, the Navy lied to Congress and got away with it. Because they said, it's just another version of this other airplane. It should have had it shouldn't have been an F-18. It should have been something else. But that's happened before. There was an instance in the 1800s, late 1800s, I think, where the Navy wanted to build some new ships, and Congress said no. And so then they said, well, then we need money to upgrade these old ships, and Congress said yes. And they basically upgraded the ships by taking the ship's wheel off, throwing out everything else, and then installing the ship's wheel on the new. It was almost that bad. But it's one of those, sometimes things like that happen for political purposes, and the important thing is that everybody be able to say that no, this was just an upgrade, and everybody's doing the wink wink nod nod thing while they're doing it. Well, here you go. Here's your photo comparison. Yeah. And it's nothing. It's all superficial. Look, everything about that is different. Yeah. I mean, there's much bigger intakes, and looking at it from on top is the same as well. It's just a much bigger airplane. The size of the spot for the F-18 EF Super Hornet, the spot is the amount of deck space it takes up. An F-18 takes up F-18 Super Hornet takes up as much deck space as an F-14, which is a huge airplane.
Right.
So I was lucky. I got to see F-14s. Yeah, that's a great photo too.
Yeah, that's just crazy different. So there you go. Yeah, I got you. I got you. I agree. Well, I think the point you made about the flexibility of Starfleet ships is important. Yeah, and I think it's less the flexibility of the ships, and it's more flexibility of their technologies at that point.
Yeah.
I think when you have something like the replicator, it basically serves so many different purposes because it's basically a transporter, right? That basic common, functionality, technology, the way it works, the core of that system has so many applications. So that's how you make your meals, and that's how you make your parts, and that's how you basically transport people. And it just, so I think you were hit it on the head where there's a certain flexibility that allows you to get away with more commonality of design.
Yeah, I think there is. And there's it's amazing the stuff that you can do with a really, really, really talented and highly trained crew. And, we're nowhere near what we see in Star Trek, right? We're not even really close to that
right.
yet, but we're getting to see the glimpses of that with additive manufacturing. Now, we're not at the point yet where you can do everything with additive manufacturing, right? You can't, metals are hard because a lot of the like when metals cool and stuff, there's various crystalline things that happen, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just about putting another one layer on top of the other. There's more to it than that. So we're not quite yet at the point where we're doing turbine blades through additive manufacturing. But with everything else, I mean, my buddy Brian Haven has 4 different additive manufacturing printers, and he's 4 different 3D printers. And if he needs a new widget, he just designs a new widget and does it. I mean, he goes online first and says, has somebody else done this widget? And if the answer is nobody's done this widget because it might be something specific that he has to connect to another widget he's already done, he just designs a widget and makes a widget. Now, trained by the U.S. Navy, he was a back end guy on a nuclear submarine. So I mean, he's got his act together on this stuff. But it's just amazing the stuff that you can do, and you need something, you design it. And I think we're getting very close to the point where that's going to be the case for a lot of stuff, where you bring the raw material along with you and you don't have to have all the parts with you because you can just make parts. I mean, the Air Force is talking about doing things like taking a C-130 or something like that and using it as a mothership for drones that you might actually build during the initial part of the flight. Stuff like that's been proposed. And so the idea being you go off on a mission and you don't necessarily know exactly which particular flavor of widget you're going to need. And so you build it once you get there and you figure out what you need. Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's your ships are flexible, but not in a way that they well, I mean, it's in the way you have, like, just think of the basic concept of 3D printers. Yeah. We have 3D printers, so it's like, oh, I need, what happened? When was it, a little while ago? They basically sent up the plans to a tool that they needed in the space station on the ISS. Yeah, and they printed it out. So I think, and this is Loci, this is what we're talking about. It's so, yeah. Well, we don't know. We've never seen a character in Star Trek say, and here's the replicator, right? Whenever we see replicators, they've always been things like, tea Earl Grey hot.
Yeah.
Or you occasionally see something in engineering, but you've never, the blueprints for the old Connie class said there were these 22-person emergency transporters. You
Right.
don't know those either. Now, of course, insert all the standard caveats about whether Franz Joseph design stuff is really canon or not. But my point is that we only see very small portions of very large ships. In the tech manual, it talks about how they printed basically a poster of the Enterprise D superimposed over the Paramount studio lot.
Yeah, I saw that.
And it's bigger than the studio lot. We're pretty damn close to it. And so, we've seen 1/100th of the size of that ship. And that's not even including the engines, the parts of the ship that you wouldn't go into. We've only seen like 1/100th of the people portions of that ship. And I personally, I've always thought that if I have a conceptual issue with how Star Trek blueprints and ship designs have been thought of, it's that I think it's likely that they look too much like buildings to me, not in terms of their orientation, but in terms of, you think of a building as, like in my apartment, I sort of think of it as it's a bunch of different rooms and ways to get to the different rooms. And you have this tendency to sort of ignore all the spaces that you really can't get to because there's ductwork there, et cetera, et cetera. And I suspect that, there are parts of a Navy ship where you've got big pieces of gear that actually extend through a couple of decks. So you've got a big space for it. I would expect that on a starship, you're going to have like the people pods, and then you're going to have the parts that are not people pods, and the people pods are going to be connected to each other. And so you're going to end up with big chunks of that hull where humans don't go to because there's a big piece of gear there. You see that a little bit. Well, you see it more than you should in Discovery. If you remember whenever they show I can't remember if it was in Discovery or it was scenes on board the Enterprise where they show elevators going through tubes.
Oh God.
That I think is the biggest problem I had with that isn't the idea that there's these big, vast areas where that aren't really part of a deck per se. It's that they would be empty. Because I think a ship is pretty packed full of stuff.
I absolutely agree. When I see the elevator, the turbo lifts, and then they show what they're zipping through, I'm like, there's no way you're going to waste all that space on a starship. Yeah. There's just no way.
But when you go back and you look at the Franz Joseph designs and every other design there's been you see these things that are clearly kind of intended to be structural members and like 10 forward, right? Sort of bracing the outer hull. And you see in the tech manual, there's a sort of cutaway where they show the space frame.
Right.
But most blueprints don't show there's this place where there's just this beam that's like 4
right. Yeah. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. But it gets back to our conversation last week about things like structural integrity fields.
Yeah.
Because realistically, you could literally make the case that a beam that's this big, this wide, and whatever, it doesn't matter what it's made of. It's not going to hold up to the stress of warp travel. That if you don't have structural integrity fields, that are dealing at a different quantum level, almost like different qualitatively. It doesn't matter what your ship's made out of; it's going to fold into like aluminum foil.
I think you end up with that 4-foot wide beam with a structural integrity field running through it.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
I mean, I think you still end up with that huge beam. And there's a line in there that says that it also they run the structural integrity field runs through the outer hull of the Enterprise D, which I interpret as meaning that it has hull plating. Because I really think I think that's the same kind of technology that we're talking about in terms of Enterprise's hull plating. And so what we really see is that the Enterprise itself has the equivalent of hull plating. I was thinking about that. We're going to talk about this next time when we have Pat here, when we talk about Nemesis. But I rewatched that battle a couple of days ago. And I remember when I first saw the movie thinking, the Enterprise really kind of, I was expecting more damage after having rammed something. But on the one hand, they rammed kind of slow. And on the other hand, I can imagine the dialogue that needed to go in there where they say, all right, set the structural integrity field to 175%. And meanwhile, on the Romulan ship, they're going like, oh shit, our structural integrity field is really badly damaged. So I don't think it's not necessarily equivalents running into each other at that point.
Right. Ben Holman says, I always figure somewhere near engineering, there's a machine shop / industrial replicator and several rooms with raw materials.
Yeah, I would expect that too. In fact, if you look back on the old Franz Joseph designs, you see that stuff like that in the secondary.
Now, let me ask you this: aren't we at the point in Star Trek where they are able to change matter to energy and back and forth at will, right?
That's actually a very interesting question. And Andy Presby and Pat Doyle and I have been talking this over. One of the things I like about doing this show is all the conversations I end up having in the week before the show happens.
Wind up being relevant.
So we've been having some interesting three-way conversations about this stuff, and it's become apparent to all of us as we sort of pull the thread on it that there's more limitations there than you might at first think. It's very easy to say, oh, the replicator is basically a transporter and you can basically just transport into existence anything you want. But we see from the food replicators that they actually, for something as simple as food, they make an effort to try to start off with some goop that's close to what they want in the final form, because it's less energy to turn the close goop into what you're aiming for. I see no reason why that wouldn't be less true for the bigger, higher density molecular component type stuff. In fact, I suspect that it's even a greater disparity. And you've only got a certain limited amount of antimatter on board. And it's very clear that there's stuff that they do and don't do that way. And so I suspect that a big chunk of being a Starfleet engineer is having a pretty good sense, aided by your computer decision tools, of when the right answer is to replicate a part and when the right answer is to build it in some other way. Which parts do you replicate and which parts do you assemble from the replicated parts? Starfleet spends a whole bunch of time. Logistics in Starfleet is knowing what stuff are you going to replicate locally and what stuff do you have to ship from someplace. It's clear they don't, based upon the tech manual, they don't replicate things like warp cores. They talk about casting warp cores, right? Which implies big buckets and foundries and stuff like that, or the 23rd or 24th century equivalent of that. So, yeah, there's stuff they do that way and stuff they don't do that way, and I'm always fascinated when I think I've got a handle on what's done what way, and then I realize no, this isn't the case. And I don't trust any of the writers on Star Trek, right? Because they just make shit up,
right?
I do trust Rick Sternbach and Mike Okuda and Andrew Probert. I trust those guys to not just make shit up. And so Sternbach wrote the entire tech manual, and I'd be really interested to see my guess is that there's another tech manual's worth of data behind that tech manual. Another tech manual's worth of thinking about how all those pieces fit together to get us what we got. I'd really like to, I think it's the case that if I could only have one conversation with Rick, I've only met him once at a con in Baltimore a few years ago. But if I run into him again, the conversation I'm going to have with him is, I want to talk to you about replicators. I want a better understanding of what you can replicate and what you can't, and what the trade-offs are, et cetera, et cetera. Because there's a line in there where he says, if you could replicate a starship, you wouldn't need to. If you're a society that can replicate an entire starship, you wouldn't need to.
Okay.
The other thing to keep in mind about power supply is people have this tendency to say, oh, well, if you've got antimatter as a power supply, your power needs have gone by the wayside. Well, antimatter is not something that you mine. It's not something that you harvest. It's something you create. And so you're dumping energy in to create antimatter. So right. Antimatter is a storage mechanism. Antimatter is your equivalent of a battery. It's not your equivalent of oil, right? It's, you turn oil into gasoline you apply some energy, but you get more energy out of the process than you put in.
Right.
Antimatter is a way of taking basically solar power, because I think that's what they said. They've got these huge solar farms. It's a way of taking solar power and condensing it, basically turning it into a liquid that you can then put in the fuel tank of a starship. So just because I got a pile of antimatter with me on the starship doesn't mean that I all of a sudden can leave all the lights on, right? Or the replicator.
Like my dad. What do I own, the antimatter company?
I've been trying to get my parents to do things like, my mom has a tendency to get up in the middle of the night and trip over things. And so I keep trying to convince my parents to just leave the kitchen light on. Just leave it on.
Right.
Put an LED in it. It's pennies a year. Just leave it on. Nah.
But no, huh?
No, I mean, LEDs really do sort of change the equation for things like that. Like there's a light. If you look right above my head in the back, you can see a light. It's off, but there's a lamp back there.
Yeah.
Right above my head.
Yeah.
And
right.
That lamp, the only time that lamp is off is when I'm doing a VTC, because it's this big bright spot behind me. The entire rest of the time I leave that lamp on. That lamp's on 22 hours a day, just because it's an LED bulb. It's going to last forever. It's easy.
And it's I know. I replaced everything, LEDs everywhere in this house.
I had replaced all my fluorescents except one with compact fluorescents.
Yep.
I replaced all my incandescents with compact fluorescents, and had a stockpile of compact fluorescents. And then when I moved, I said, you know what? I'm not going to move these again.
Yeah.
If there was no alternative, I'm willing to accept the risk. But there is an alternative. I want to move to LEDs. I'm not willing to accept the risk. And so I took them to a disposal place and disposed of them. Gotcha. And now I have all LEDs.
We're at the end of our time. I was looking. There's a lot of comments. I think everyone got a kick out of what we talked about tonight. The comments were really interesting. Just reading through, you guys had some really interesting thoughts about everything.
And I'm going to go and do what I do normally, which is I've adopted the habit of going in and rewatching the show, going through all the comments, because you have to rewatch the show to get through all the comments. It doesn't let you just scroll through, unfortunately. And then posting something that if I find questions, etc., I'll post something. I kind of, right before the Axanar channel got axed on, must have been Thursday, maybe Wednesday.
I think it was was it Wednesday? It was Tuesday or Wednesday.
And I had been really, really diligent. And I think it was on Sunday I had gone through all the comments and I had put up like a page worth of things. And it's all gone now.
Oh, God.
It is what it is. It's okay.
All right. Yeah, I know.
But at least we didn't lose any of the episodes. So.
No, yeah, exactly. It's all started on the Air Studios channel. So,
but I'm going to try to go through maybe as early as tomorrow and go through the comments and stuff. One last thought on all this is that if you look at how phasers work by disrupting the strong nuclear force.
Okay.
That also has some interesting implications for things like replicators, right? When you start talking about strong nuclear force, you're now talking about transmutation of elements.
Oh, okay.
So, maybe I'd like to have some uranium, but all I have is hydrogen. It'll take me a while, but I can get there.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
And
again,
I don't remember anybody specifically talking about that in the Star Trek universe.
No. Yeah. All right. Well, listen, we got to go. I've got doggies to take care of. Thank you. Oh, look at that. Stephen Ross comes in at the last second with a $5 super chat. He says the chief engineer storms on the Ares Bridge. Who's fiddling with the thermostat? Yes, Andrew, we know we got hacked. We got hacked and then accused of spamming because the hacker spammed. So we're working on it. We're working to get it back up. We hope to have it back up. And I may need everyone's help. So hopefully all of you are Facebook friends of mine because we will be back tomorrow night at 10. And at that time, we're going to talk about how you all can help us get the Ares, the Axanar channel back up. So thank you very much. It sounded too much like Elvis that time. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you, everyone. We will see you tomorrow, 10 o'clock at night, Axanar After Dark. That's Sunday night. And we'll have more for you. And then next Saturday, more Starfleet Tactical. Thank you, everyone. We're going to be putting more videos up here on the Ares channel here. So stay tuned. I'll have stuff going up all day tomorrow. Some of which you've seen, but it's a chance for you guys to see more stuff. So make sure you hit the notifications icon so you find out what we're doing. All right? All right. Thanks to Lissa, our producer. Thank you, Lissa. We will see you guys tomorrow night at 10.
Lissa is great as always.
As always. Thanks so much.
Bye.